Michigan history, shadows of the first people. Long before maps bore the name Michigan, an intricate world thrived in the dense forests and along the shores of the Great Lakes. In the 17th century, the land echoed with the languages of the Algonquian-speaking nations, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, Miami, and Potawatomi. Together, three of these nations formed a powerful alliance known as the Three Fires. Their presence was not scattered nor primitive. It was deliberate, interconnected, and deeply rooted in the rhythms of the earth. But they were not alone. To the southeast, shadows of another culture loomed. The Huron-Wyandot, members of the Wendat Confederacy, speaking Iroquoian tongues. These people, mysterious and often misunderstood, carved their lives into the wetlands and wooded hills of what would later become Michigan. At the moment of first contact with Europeans, these nations cultivated the land with precision and balance. Agriculture fed them corn, beans, squash, while the wilderness supplied deer, fish, and wild rice. Along the inland trails, they harvested seed-bearing plants, some now forgotten, others surviving only in the soil's memory. Then, in 1622, a stranger crossed the threshold. Etienne Brule, a French explorer whose name is still wrapped in legend, became the first European to set foot on this territory. But he was only the beginning. Behind him came missionaries cloaked in crosses, fur traders chasing fortune, and explorers searching in vain for a passage to the Pacific. At first, tensions flared. Arrows met muskets in cautious encounters. But something shifted. The forest, once divided by fear, began to murmur a new alliance. French traders exchanged more than goods. They exchanged trust. Knives, beads, firearms, and alcohol passed into native hands. In return came pelts, guiding knowledge, and sustenance. Marriages were arranged not for love, but survival, a calculated merging of lineages that bound French and native families in blood and obligation. The union was fragile but powerful. What unfolded was not just a tale of colonization, but of negotiation, mystery, and uneasy alliance. The land we now call Michigan was never conquered in a single battle. It was slowly transformed through whispered bargains in the woods, shared meals around smoky fires, and quiet footsteps along shadowed paths. This is where the history of Michigan begins. Michigan history, forts, flames, and the shadow of empire. In the misty northern reaches of the Great Lakes, where the waters churn and ice whispers secrets to the pines, a French outpost emerged in 1668. Sault Ste. Marie, now a quiet name on a map, was once the pulse of a new world. Missionaries had gathered there as early as 1641, holding sacred rites before a silent crowd of 2,000 Ojibwe. But this was no ordinary mission. It marked the first European settlement in Michigan, a crossroads where faith, ambition, and diplomacy collided. Just over 3 decades later, a name echoing with intrigue carved itself into the region's destiny. Antoine de la Mothe Cadillac, a man both revered and controversial, founded Detroit in 1701. What began as a fur trading post quickly swelled into the crown jewel of French influence in the Great Lakes. To the north, Fort Michilimackinac rose at the vital Straits of Mackinac, a choke point between Lake Huron and Lake Michigan, and a place where power could be controlled or contested. But Michigan's role in history was never static. It stood at the intersection of empires, France, Great Britain, and later the United States, each seeking dominion, each drawing blood. From the late 1600s through the dawn of the 1800s, European powers waged relentless war. Muskets thundered not just across European fields, but deep into Michigan's forests. During the chaos of the 7 Years' War, known in America as the French and Indian War, French garrisons fell. In 1760, the British seized control, and by the Treaty of Paris in 1763, they claimed Michigan and all French lands east of the Mississippi. But conquest is rarely quiet. Where the French had woven alliances with the land's original stewards, the British sowed resentment. They dismissed native customs, disregarded agreements, and disrupted trade. The response was swift and ruthless. A storm of indigenous fury swept across Michigan. Tribes once tolerant of the French turned their weapons on British outposts. Forts crumbled. Soldiers fell, not in glorious battles, but in desperate, one-sided massacres deep in the wilderness. One by one, British strongholds vanished into smoke and silence. And then, Pontiac rose. The Ottawa chief, sharp-eyed and unyielding, rallied a powerful force. In a siege that chilled the hearts of those inside, Detroit was surrounded for more than 4 months. Pontiac's warriors struck from the shadows, a whispering force of vengeance and reclamation. British commander Henry Gladwin, caught in the siege, clung to the fort with desperate resolve. Though Detroit held, the siege sent tremors through the empire. The British, rattled and bloodied, began to understand this land would not be tamed easily. Still, resistance faded, alliances fractured, and Michigan remained in British hands. For now, the land was changing. The fires of rebellion were beginning to flicker farther east, and the shadows that once protected the old ways were growing thin. Michigan history, conquest, canal, and the vanishing tribes. By 1783, the war for independence had ended, but for the land that would become Michigan, a different struggle had just begun. In the aftermath of Revolution, the United States claimed this wild northern frontier. Yet ownership on paper was one thing. Control on the ground, among ancient forests and sovereign nations, was something far more elusive. In 1787, Michigan was absorbed into the Northwest Territory, a vast, unformed domain that also included present-day Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, and Wisconsin. But beneath this territorial reshuffling lay a cold, calculated plan. The U.S. government, eager to expand westward, set into motion a relentless campaign. The acquisition of native lands, often cloaked in the legal veils of treaties, but backed by the threat, or reality, of force. Resistance came swiftly. Native coalitions rose to defend their homelands. But in 1794, at the Battle of Fallen Timbers near what is now Toledo, Ohio, their hopes shattered. General Anthony Wayne led U.S. forces to a decisive victory, breaking indigenous resistance in the region. That same year, the Jay Treaty forced the British to withdraw from the Northwest by 1796, finally sealing Michigan's fate under American sovereignty. The cost to Native peoples was immense. Over the following decades, land by land, treaty by treaty, they were driven from the places that had shaped their identities for generations. Some were forced west, into unfamiliar territories. Others were penned onto reservations. A few faded quietly into the margins of a society not their own. By 1805, the Michigan Territory was carved out of Indiana, and Detroit became its capital, a city that had once belonged to the Three Fires and echoed with French prayers, now claimed under a new banner. But peace was fleeting. In the War of 1812, Governor William Hull, plagued by indecision, surrendered Detroit to the British without a fight. It was a humiliating moment. Yet, in 1813, American fortunes reversed. Oliver Hazard Perry's victory on Lake Erie sent British forces retreating, and U.S. control of Michigan was restored. Then came the man who would transform the wilderness. Lewis Cass, appointed territorial governor, saw a future others had not yet imagined. He championed settlement, promoted infrastructure, and laid the foundation for Michigan's transformation. In 1818, steamships began traversing Lake Erie, linking Detroit to Buffalo and opening the Great Lakes to a new kind of traveler. But it was the Erie Canal, completed in 1825, that changed everything. A waterway stretching from the Hudson River to the Great Lakes, it became a corridor of dreams. Farmers, craftsmen, and fortune seekers poured into Michigan, lured by the promise of rich land and river trade. In turn, Michigan's wheat, timber, and minerals found their way to eastern cities hungry for growth. The forest paths widened into roads. Cass's highway chain, connecting Detroit with Chicago, Saginaw, and Port Huron, mapped the future of the interior. Villages rose. Fields expanded. The land remembered by some as sacred was now reimagined as opportunity. But beneath the progress lay a deeper truth. As Michigan entered the American story, much of its older story was being buried, quietly, deliberately, and irreversibly. Michigan history, the war that wasn't, and the wealth that waited. As the 1830s dawned, Michigan hungered for statehood. Its leaders dreamed of building canals, roads, and railways, transforming wilderness into a modern empire. A constitution was drafted in 1835, a declaration that the territory was ready to join the Union. But fate had one final trial in store. It would come, not from war drums or distant powers, but from an unexpected place, Ohio. What followed became known as the Toledo War. There were no great battles, no famous casualties, yet this quiet boundary dispute threatened to upend Michigan's ambitions. At the heart of the conflict lay a thin strip of land, the Toledo Strip, stretching west from the shores of Lake Erie to the Indiana border. Rich in promise, it was coveted by both states. By law, under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, the land should have been Michigan's. But Ohio, drawing from flawed surveys and fueled by the desire to control Toledo, the critical terminus of its canal system, refused to yield. Troops were mobilized. Shots were nearly fired. For a brief moment, the Midwest teetered on the edge of civil war. The federal government stepped in. The compromise: Michigan would relinquish the Toledo Strip, and in exchange, it would receive the western Upper Peninsula, a rocky expanse many at the time dismissed as worthless. But beneath the trees and granite cliffs lay secrets. Within years, the Upper Peninsula revealed its hidden wealth, vast veins of copper and iron. What had been mocked as a poor trade became Michigan's greatest prize, feeding foundries, fueling industry, and drawing waves of immigrants eager to work the mines. Statehood was finally granted in 1837, and Michigan's transformation accelerated. A fever swept the land, Michigan fever. Settlers poured in, driven by whispers of fertile soil and a better life. They arrived by canal, by lake, by foot, families from New York, New England, and Europe carving farms from the wilderness. Cities flourished. Detroit, once a fur post, grew into a commercial titan. Lansing, more central and protected, was named capital in 1847. In the north, miners struck red copper and iron, building rough towns from pine and stone. Rail lines soon followed, carrying ore, grain, and hope. But Michigan's rise was not without fire and sacrifice. In 1854, amid growing national tension over slavery, a new political force was born. In the town of Jackson, the Republican Party held its first convention. The call for abolition rang loud across Michigan's towns, and when the Civil War began, the state answered. 90,000 Michiganders served in the Union Army. 14,000 never returned. Among them were members of a black regiment, brave souls drawn not only from Michigan, but also from Canada West, now Ontario, crossing borders to fight for freedom. After the war, the Republican Party ruled the state with an iron grip. One of its fiercest voices, Hazen Pingree, rose from Detroit's streets to the governor's mansion. A reformer and a radical, he challenged monopolies, curbed corruption, and launched progressive legislation that echoed across the nation. Michigan was no longer a frontier. It was becoming a force. Yet beneath every step forward, the land remembered a different past. And in the shadows of progress, stories still stirred, of lost tribes, contested borders, and the quiet power of the ground beneath our feet. Michigan history, fire, steel, and the machine that changed the world. Beneath the thick canopy of Michigan's forests and the quiet slopes of its northern hills, the ground was not still. It hummed with potential. In the Upper Peninsula, men clawed through ancient rock, pulling treasure from 3 iron ranges: Marquette, Gogebic, and Menominee. To the north, in the icy grasp of the Keweenaw Range, copper veins shimmered beneath the granite. These metals, hidden for millennia, now poured into foundries, rails, and cities. Michigan's bones had become its lifeblood. But it wasn't just stone that built Michigan's future, it was wood. The great pine forests of the Lower Peninsula fell like thunder. Between 1840 and 1860, the Saginaw Valley roared with sawmills. Timber was floated down rivers, stacked into ships, and sent across the continent. Lumber camps sprang up like ghost towns overnight, only to vanish when the trees were gone. By 1900, the pine was mostly exhausted, and the Upper Peninsula took its turn, its untouched forests feeding a nation hungry for homes, factories, and railroads. Yet, by the dawn of the 20th century, the forest and the mine would be eclipsed by something far more powerful: the machine. Michigan's economy, once a patchwork of farms, logging camps, or mills, was pulled into a single, roaring force: the automotive industry. Detroit became its beating heart, and as the world descended into World War I, Michigan's factories shifted into overdrive, producing weapons, engines, and machinery for the front lines. But with triumph came tragedy. The Great Depression of 1929 did not strike Michigan softly. The very industry that had fueled its rise, automotive manufacturing, was not built on essentials. Demand collapsed, unemployment soared, and Michigan became a symbol of the nation's broken economic engine. In 1932, a political shift echoed through the state. Michigan abandoned its Republican roots and became one of America's unpredictable swing states. Organized labor surged in strength. In 1937, the United Automobile Workers, UAW, won a seat at the table, becoming the voice of tens of thousands in the factories. And then came another war, and another transformation. During World War II, Detroit earned a new name: the Arsenal of Democracy. Its factories no longer produced cars. They built tanks, planes, and military vehicles by the thousands. The hum of industry was now the drumbeat of victory. When peace returned, the factories did not rest. Michigan entered a golden age of consumer production. Cars rolled off assembly lines. Suburbs exploded. Highways stretched like arteries from Detroit to the edges of the Great Lakes. But deep in the shadows of progress, something was shifting. Inner cities began to wither. As wealth moved outward, poverty crept inward. In response, state leaders launched bold efforts. Among them, the Renaissance Center in downtown Detroit. Glass towers rose on the riverfront, symbols of a city trying to reclaim its strength. Yet division lingered, not just between rich and poor, but black and white. Detroit burned twice in the 20th century, first in 1943 and again in 1967. These are not accidents. They were eruptions of frustration, of injustice, of a city torn between opportunity and exclusion. Still, amid the smoke and sorrow, Michigan refused to yield. In 1963, it became the first state in the nation to enshrine a Department of Civil Rights in its constitution, a bold step toward inclusion. It pushed forward policies to protect minorities, women, and people with disabilities, declaring to the nation that even in the heart of industry, equality had a place. From iron and timber to steel and justice, Michigan's story is one of reinvention. And though the machines may change, and the cities may rise and fall, the land remembers. Michigan history, recessions, rebirth, and the shadows of dissent. By the late 20th century, Michigan stood at a crossroads once again. The fires of the automotive empire that had once fueled its rise now flickered uncertainly. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a wave of economic collapse struck the state with unforgiving force. Unemployment soared, factories shuttered, and the rust of a fading industrial age crept across its cities. Entire communities were brought to their knees. But in the face of collapse, something began to stir, not in defiance, but in determination. Government, businesses, and schools joined forces in a desperate but hopeful alliance. Together, they reached for reinvention, drawing in new industries, investing in education, and turning attention toward Michigan's quiet but powerful asset: tourism. As the 1990s arrived, the winds shifted. A revival of automotive production, combined with the rise of high-tech innovation, sparked what many called an economic renaissance. Unemployment dropped. The economy no longer leaned solely on cars, but balanced itself across tourism, agriculture, manufacturing, and services. For a moment, it seemed Michigan had found a way forward. But Renaissance, like all golden hours, can fade quickly. By the early 2000s, the auto industry stumbled once more, caught in global shifts and technological disruption. Urban sprawl crept across the countryside, swallowing prime farmland beneath malls and subdivisions. Cities hollowed out while suburbs swelled. Unemployment crept upward again, one of the highest rates in the nation. And in the cracks of uncertainty, something darker took root. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, a growing militia movement emerged from Michigan's rural edges. Anger over economics, government, and culture brewed in hidden places. After the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995, the FBI turned its gaze toward Michigan, monitoring extremist groups with increasing concern. Yet still, the state reached for solutions. Economic diversification became the mantra. Wind farms dotted the horizon. Tech startups were courted. In 2008, a sign of national confidence arrived. A $550 million nuclear physics research project awarded to Michigan State University by the U.S. Department of Energy. Innovation had become not just hope, but necessity. But unrest did not vanish with progress. In 2020, a chilling plot unfolded. Michigan Governor Gretchen Whitmer was the target of a foiled kidnapping attempt. The echoes of anti-government rhetoric were unmistakable. Whitmer herself pointed to the rhetoric of Republican leadership, drawing national attention to the growing chasm in American political discourse, one that had carved deep lines through Michigan's landscape. And so, Michigan enters the present, a state forged by fire, fueled by innovation, haunted by unrest, and yet always resilient. Its history is one of contradiction, industry and wilderness, progress and backlash, collapse and rebirth. The shadows of the past linger still. If you found this journey through Michigan history captivating, there's so much more to explore. Subscribe to History Love to uncover the forgotten, the hidden, and the legendary chapters of our world's past. Comment below, what surprised you most about Michigan's story? And don't forget to like and share, because history, like Michigan, is never truly finished. Stay curious. Stay bold. This is History Love.